Yeah, it's noon on the dot, so we'll just go ahead and jump right in. I'm hosting you guys today because we get to hear from Jen as one of our speakers. So she and Dr. Jardon are going to be talking about starting your calves on the right hoof with colostrum management. I've had a chance to listen to the both of them give a similar talk, and it's really enlightening. And I think I learn something new every time I see it. So I'm really excited to have them join us today. If you are new to our series, you can catch up on previous webinars on our website. So those are available and on extension.iastate.edu/dairy team. You can find our previous recordings of other webinars there. And we encourage you to join us next week, July, or yes, not next week, but the week after the 4th of July. You can join us for Managing Heifer Inventory with Fred Hall and Greg Pallas from DRMS on July 22nd. We're going to hear about heifer health from Dr. Jardon again, and then on July 30th, Victor Gomez from Kansas State is going to be joining us to talk about heifer reproduction. So we've had a great start to this series, and excited to pass it off to Jen and Philip and learn some more about colostrum.
All right, very good. So Jen and I have these slides split up. We're kind of going to tag team a little bit, going back and forth with each other, and we'll go from there. So everybody knows colostrum is important, and it kind of gets to be a boring topic sometimes. People think, oh yeah, we know it's important. But there's so many things that we can do to make things better. And it frequently happens that there's procedural drift. And we're going to talk about that some, about the 5 Qs of colostrum management and things that can go wrong in the system. And maybe some ways to give you some ideas how to make a better system on your dairy. So I was really excited when I interviewed for my job here, to see that Jen had some great stuff on colostrum, and that we were going to be a great coworker. So it's been great to put this together with Jen, and let's go from there. Jen, you want to go to the next slide?
Thanks, Dr. Jardon. And like Dr. Jardon said, we're going to be talking about colostrum management. And just kind of as a review, as we talk about colostrum management, it really is the single most important factor for calf health and survival. If we take a look at, just the long-term impact it has on that calf, and then into the longevity of that animal, we see reduced treatment rates, we see reduced mortality, we see improved growth rates and feed efficiency, increased milk production in that first and second lactation, and also decreased age at first calving. So there's a lot of benefits to, always being on top of our colostrum management program, because it's not just for that pre-weaning phase, but it does make a difference through their whole life. And so today, like Dr. Jardon said, we're going to walk through those 5 Qs. I remember when I first started in extension, there was only 3 Qs. So we had quality, quantity, and quickness. And then over the years, as we did more research and learned more about taking care of our calves on that first day of life, we have added squeaky, clean, and quantify. So we may spend a little bit more time today talking about squeaky clean, because that's maybe a little bit newer to the 5 Qs than some of the others. So, but we are going to kind of walk through each of these as we get started here. So 5 Qs: quality, quantity, quickness, squeaky clean, and quantify. So again, first up is quality. And so when we take a look at quality, we want to make sure it's the highest quality it can be. And so when we talk about what does that mean, it really means we want to have colostrum quality that's greater than 50 grams per liter of IgGs, or those immunoglobulins. And if we can get more IgGs per liter, we see the benefits of higher quality than that, but 50 grams is kind of our cutoff for what determines that high quality colostrum. And the reason that's so important is those IgGs, or immunoglobulins, really represent that calf's immune system, at least the first couple weeks to months of life, because they're born essentially without an immune system, and they rely heavily on that maternal colostrum to provide their immune system. So it's their passive immunity relying on that colostrum to provide that for those first few weeks of life, until they can start to build up their first couple weeks.
Okay. Jen, I think you might have been cutting out a little bit there. Is it just on my side or is it everywhere? But I think, can everybody hear me okay?
I hear you okay. Yeah, Jen cut out for a second on us too.
Okay, very good. So when we talk about quality, we're talking really the amount of antibodies in the colostrum. And traditionally, we've done that with the colostrometer, which is this picture over here to the right, which is really measures the density. And essentially, if the colostrum has a lot of antibodies in it, it's heavy, which means that the colostrometer floats in there. And when it floats, you see the green area there at the top there at the top of the colostrometer. That means that it's a good to go. If it sinks, that means it's too light and it gets to the red area, and that's bad. So these colostrometers, they had a lot of disadvantages though. One that had to be measured at room temperature, that's the way it's calibrated for. And then when you right after harvest, it's kind of foamy, and then they're really fragile. They're made of glass and they would break easily. And then some researchers found out that you could use a refractometer, and that's where most people have gone now. You can use either a digital one, that's this bottom one here, or an analog one, that the manual up on the top when you look at the blue line across there. And those work really well. What we want, the research says that about 22 on the brick scale is about 50 grams per liter, which is where we kind of want to make sure the colostrum is. Now, some people will pick a more stringent one. They'll say, okay, maybe 23 or 24, and then maybe move it depending on the time of year. And if they have, at times of year they have more colostrum, they'll increase it. And if they have to, they'll maybe lower it a little bit. Okay, Jim, go to the next slide. So the amount that we feed, the quantity. So the general rule of thumb is that we need a gallon of good colostrum into a calf in that first 12 hours or so. That first feeding, we want to get a minimum of 150 to 200 grams of IgG, which is about a gallon. Another way to look at that is about 10% of the body weight. So of course a Jersey you need less than a Holstein. But we really know that in a lot of things, more is not better, but probably with antibodies, it is better. More is better. So if we could get greater than 300 grams in the first 24 hours, that would be good. So we might be able to do that by giving a gallon at the start, and then maybe a little bit more 12 hours later, or by just picking really higher quality colostrum to start with. All right. So there's frequently a question about how we should feed a calf. In the dairy world, we realize that the calves just aren't very good at getting up and nursing the cow. Like we rely on that to happen in the beef world, but in the dairy world, it just doesn't happen for several reasons. Probably thousands of years of selection has made it taken out the ability of the calf to get up and nurse right away. That also there's some diseases that a calf could get, Johne's and that kind of thing from nursing the cow. And then the bags are just sometimes too low. So it's probably not a good idea to rely on the calf to nurse the cow, although it does work, and some people do that. So a bottle is more natural, and some people think that's better, and that's fine. But an esophageal tube also works very well, and that way we can make sure that calf got all that we want it to get. So research has showed that they both work very well, and I think either one can work quite well. An esophageal tube, though, I think people need to be trained well to do that. One problem I see is that some people are a little bit too afraid to put it in far enough, and then they'll put the volume of fluid too quickly in the back of the calf's throat, and it's not down the wrong tube. It's not down a tube at all sometimes, and the calf just can't swallow enough, and it might get some inspiration pneumonia. It is really hard to get down the wrong tube. I don't want to say it's impossible, but I think people need to have confidence that they're getting it down there and be trained to get it on there and know that they're in the right spot. All right, Jen?
Yeah, so our next cue would be quickness. And kind of going back to what Dr. Jardon was talking about, the amount of colostrum that we're feeding to those calves in the first day of life. Really want to get that first feeding into those calves as soon as possible, or within about 1 to 2 hours after they're born. We know that calves can really only absorb those antibodies the first 24 hours of life through that small intestinal wall. So we really need to make sure that we're fast acting when we're administering that colostrum. If you look at this graph here, we have the percent absorption, and it's really, when you look at this, even at those first couple of hours after they're born, they really only absorb about 35% of those IgGs. So as the time goes on, as they get older, those first 24 hours, even at 6 hours, we've cut that in half. And by 24 hours, they're no longer able to absorb those immunoglobulins. They're going to be able to absorb all the other nutrients, which are very important. So, feeding into transition milk can still be of value, but it's the IgGs that we lose after about 24 hours.
Is this one mine? This one's mine. Yep. So now we're going to talk about being clean. And this is one of my passions and one of my pet peeves about some of the way colostrum is managed on farms. So I'm going to go through why this is important and some of the things that can go wrong in this area. So there's a couple reasons to be concerned about these bacteria. One is there could be immediate illness because some of these, the bacteria in there can cause disease. So for example, E. coli and Salmonella can do that. There's some other diseases that the calves kind of get later. So Salmonella Dublin's an example of that. It kind of hides out in the lymph nodes for a couple months, and then right about weaning, they'll break with a septicemia from Salmonella Dublin, which is the host-adapted Salmonella. And then, of course, there's long-term things like Johne's or bovine leukemia virus. So where does this come from? It can come from the milk or the colostrum. It can come, if the cow has mastitis or something like that. It can get from the cow's skin. And of course, it can come from manure. It's always impossible to keep all manure out of milk. And so that's, we should just always assume a little bit got in there. Milkers' hands can be, and it can come from the equipment. So there's several things that make colostrum spoil. Contaminated from the start, the cooling time, if it gets cold too slowly, it'll start to grow bacteria. And in the storage temperature, of course, and the storage time. And we'll go through each one of those individually here. But back to this first part over here. But the bacteria can cause diseases themselves, but bacteria cause a decrease in the amount of antibodies that are absorbed. Bob James did that for his PhD back in the 80s at Virginia Tech, and that pretty interesting work that the bacteria not only are dangerous themselves, but they actually decrease the ability of the gut to absorb antibodies. All right, Jim. So harvest and storage are key. We want to keep bacteria out of the milk as best we can, but some are going to sneak in. We're going to have a hard time keeping 100% of them out. And you think about colostrum, and when it's warm, it's the perfect environment for bugs to grow. It's got some sugar in there with the lactose. It's got some protein, the antibodies and the casein. And then it's got the liquid, and it's got all the minerals and vitamins. Bacteria just love that area. So I like to have people treat colostrum just like they would treat milk sold for humans. So when you think about how we sell milk for humans, we put a milker unit on a cow, and the milk comes out. It goes through a pipeline. And about a minute later, it goes through a plate cooler, and it goes from cow temperature to down in the 30s in just a matter of a minute or so. And if something goes wrong in that system and it cools slower, or if it's in a bulk tank that cools it and it cools the milk, and if we forget to turn it on just for a little bit, the creamery knows. They grow the bacteria in there and they say, hey, your milk is not very good this time because it has a lot of bacteria growing in it. But Colostrum's the same way. We take colostrum and we set it out in a 5-gallon bucket in the breezeway after the milking's done. And then a couple hours later, the calf feeder comes by to measure it and feed it to the calves. That's set out there for 2 hours. And we wouldn't think of going to the church picnic and eating the potato salad that's been out all afternoon. So it's important to get it cold quickly. And when I say quickly, I mean really fast, faster than most people think of getting something cold like colostrum. You can also consider heat treating it. And I'm using the word heat treatment instead of pasteurization because the official pasteurization temperature is 145 degrees for 30 minutes. And Sandra Jardon at the University of Minnesota did some really nice work to show that if we cook it at 145 degrees, we'll destroy the antibodies. But at 140, we can cook it a long time and not destroy the antibodies. So that's the recommendation, 140 degrees for 60 minutes. We can also put potassium sorbate in, which will help keep bacteria from growing. But I prefer to use a cold temperature to keep bacteria from growing and heat to kill the bacteria that are there. All right, next slide. So this is one of the things that can happen. This abomasum here, these are abomasums. This one to the left is from a California calf that got some rotten colostrum. The abomasum can be very inflamed. And a lot of these calves, when they get really bad colostrum, they'll be sick at 1 day and dead at 2, or have a lot of diarrhea that first couple of days. I know in vet school we learned that if all the different diseases that can cause scours, and that if it's day 1, it's likely E. coli, but I think it's more likely to be just the calf got spoiled colostrum. E. coli might be one of the things in there, but it's really more that the calf got all sorts of bad things in there, not just E. coli. This one in the middle is a normal calf. It's got a normal casein clot and not near as inflamed, and that's kind of what we want it to look like. The one on the right's from a 4-day-old calf that was here in Iowa that probably got some bad spoiled colostrum, and it was sick at 1 day and then it finally died at 3 days from this bad abomasitis, and the calf did not have scours, but it probably was going to be developing it pretty fast if it had lived. All right, next slide. So there's several different researchers and consultants have come up with different numbers. I quoted ones down here from Sandra Jardon that the total plate count should be less than 100,000 in milk that we're feeding to a calf, and the total coliform count should be less than 10,000. So this example over here to the right is from a dairy that actually was getting colostrum from their home dairy, and then also colostrum from their sister dairy down the road. And those bottom about 8 samples are from their own dairy, and the 2 on the top are from down the road. And notice that 5,000, that 5.7 followed by a whole bunch of zeros, that's 5.7 million bacteria per mil. That's a lot. And that's enough to kill a calf. A half gallon of that or a gallon of that could possibly kill a calf. So it's really important that we keep that kind of colostrum out of calves and keep that from being happening in the first place. And these samples happen to come, the veterinarian that took these samples sent them to the creamery for tests, but a lot of veterinary clinics can do it, and then a lot of creameries can do that kind of test for you. Okay, next. Okay, so just some things that can happen with equipment. These are gaskets on the top left here from a dairy that had like 5 buckets to harvest colostrum in. And they put them all 5 right next to each other. And those are the ones over here to the right. So this milk that developed in there did not get washed off. And so it's really important that when you wash things in a wash tank or in a dishwasher, you can't have spoons up next to each other, especially if the spoon on the bottom had peanut butter on it. So the same thing here. There's no way this is going to get clean. And then the half of the day between milkings, a lot of bacteria can grow in there and then seed down the back of the colostrum. Then on the bottom left, there's a gasket here on this lid that's used for harvesting colostrum. And since that gasket's still on there, a lot of that milk just can't get cleaned out of there. So it's really important to take these off, scrub them up well before you put them into the wash vat. Don't trust the wash vat to be able to get into those nooks and crannies it can't reach. And then there's this ferrule on this on the lid of this one in the bottom right, and that is there's brushes that are sold for almost any size of pipe or ferrule like that. And I would suggest people they buy it and scrub that out after every milking, so that keeps that from building up in there. Because bacteria get on there, and then that seeds down the next batch of colostrum and makes it spoil faster. All right, next. I think this is you, Jen, right?
Right. Yep. So kind of continuing on with squeaky clean equipment and ways that we can investigate where we might be getting some sources of contamination. There are some tools available for producers and industry to use. What I'm going to show you next is a video that our extension dairy team put together. It's a training video. We have a calf management training video series talking about different calf management practices, but one of them is looking at monitoring hygiene within your calf feeding equipment with the use of either protein swabs or the ATP meter. So I'm going to hit play on this 3-minute video, and we'll watch that, and then we'll come back for a discussion.
Monitoring cleanliness and hygiene is relatively easy to do on farms using the techniques that are used in the food industry. Protein residue swabs are one tool to evaluate cleanliness. These swabs do not detect bacteria, rather they detect the presence of residual protein left on surfaces. This technique is carried out by removing the swab from its tube or case and swabbing surfaces such as the inside of bottles, pails, rubber nipples, mixing tanks, or any other surface where milk is handled. The swab is then reinserted in its case, the bulb is bent until it snaps, and the reagent is squeezed into the tube. The tube is then slightly swirled to mix the contents. This technique uses a chemical reaction that develops color. Clean surfaces with little or no protein residue result in a green color. Development of a gray color indicates a slight presence of protein residue. If the test develops light or dark purple, it indicates a greater presence of protein residue, which may be the result of improper washing or cleaning procedures. Another technique used to monitor hygiene relies on bioluminescence, or biological reactions that produce light. This technique uses ATP swabs that detect the presence of bacteria. The procedure is the same as outlined for the protein residue swabs, except that this technique requires a special handheld reader called a luminometer. This device measures the brightness of the light produced by the reaction, and it expresses the results in relative light units, or RLU. After swabbing and reinserting the swab in its tube, the reaction develops as soon as the reagent is squeezed out of the bulb. At this point, the whole tube is inserted into the luminometer. The device then takes a reading and displays the resulting RLUs. When bacteria are present, the reaction will produce light. The brighter the reaction, the greater the bacterial presence, and the higher the number on the display. A benchmark for this technique is a reading below 100 RLU, or the lower the better. In summary, clean and dry feeding equipment and instruments help keep healthy calves. Proper washing procedures include water, detergents, and disinfectants. A sanitizer may also be used to reduce bacterial count. Monitoring cleanliness is a relatively easy and simple procedure that can be done with either protein residue swabs or ATP swabs. For protein swabs, the results should develop a green color, and for ATP swabs, the reading should be less than 100, the lower the better. We hope this video provided general guidelines for monitoring hygiene and cleanliness in the calf kitchen.
So these ATP and protein swabs are becoming more common on farm now. We see a lot of our veterinarians carry the ATP meters. Maybe your calf and heifer specialists might be carrying them. As they get on a lot of farms, they can use these tools to help monitor hygiene. And so the ATP meter is a little bit more spendy. If you wanted to purchase the machine, it's probably close to $1,200. So that's why we see a lot of our vets and technicians carry them and use them on multiple farms. But it is a good way to help investigate sources of contamination. If you think about all the ways that milk gets to the calf, so we collect the milk in the parlor, and we may transfer it into a few different buckets or equipment to get it to maybe a pasteurizer or the bottles and buckets before it even gets fed to the calf. So I think there could be lots of sources where this could be become contaminated. So colostrum collection buckets, lids, nursing bottles and nipples, the esophageal tube feeder, even our automatic calf feeder, because they have a lot of hoses and a lot of equipment that's involved with those calf feeders. So anywhere that there's difficult areas to clean could become sources of contamination where we see that accumulation of buildup. And so just some examples here as we take a look at using an ATP meter. So as I get on different farms or working with industry representatives, if we're troubleshooting a dairy, looking at monitoring hygiene on the farm, you can start to take a look at where those sources might be. And so I use Dr. Don Sockett's from University of Madison's guidelines for using the ATP meter, or measuring the relative light units from the meter. And the goal that we want to have is less than 50, although acceptable would be less than 100. But when we get a reading of 200, that becomes borderline, or start to investigate where we might be getting some contamination. And then anything over 200 is considered unacceptable, and we're seeing some contamination within our calf feeding equipment. So if you take a look at example up on the upper right, where that reading is reading over 3,000 relative light units, that's a source of contamination. Maybe it's not getting cleaned as well as we'd like to see. It's where we are putting the colostrum before it goes into a freezer bag. So we have that drain on the end there that could be contaminated if it's not cleaned properly, if we're not doing that on a daily basis. It's also kind of a round piece of equipment, so it may become more difficult to get all the edges clean within that container there. And then the middle pictures with the buckets, two different types of buckets. The blue bucket that's reading over 6,000 relative light units. You may notice up on the upper top of that blue bucket, some scratches, and you see that yellowing color. So anytime our equipment starts to get abrasions, cracking, and you can feel that the surface is starting to become rough, that's an area that could become a source of contamination over time. So when we look at our equipment, you want to make sure that we're replacing that equipment often, as compared to the pink bucket that's reading about 100. It's a very smooth bucket right now. There's no cracks, no abrasions within the bucket. So that reading actually read low. And then taking a look at maybe some of your mixing or even your cleaning equipment. So on the left-hand side, we have a wire whisk that we would use to maybe whisk our powder, whether that's a colostrum powder or our milk replacer. If we're not necessarily cleaning that properly, that could read a little bit high. as well as just our scrub brushes. So yes, those are used to clean equipment, but if we're not going back and disinfecting or cleaning them properly, they could also be a source of contamination. So I think this is you, Phil.
Very good, very good. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It's colostrum cooling. And I think it's something that dairies in general could do a better job of frequently. So we'll start with the tour of this refrigerator over here on the right. So the morning I was there, these 10 bottles of colostrum were harvested and put into this refrigerator. And they're put in there warm. And then inside 2 of them, we put thermometers, and inside 3 of them, we put thermometers. And then we also put thermometers in one in a freezer. So I'm over here to the left. We'll see there's a bottle labeled blue. There's a blue bottle, an orange bottle, and then a gray bottle. And then we have one that we put in the freezer that's kind of the yellow one. So if we start up here at about 8 o'clock, they were put in the refrigerator. And then let's go forward an hour to 9 o'clock, 2 hours to 10, 3 o'clock to 11. Let's go to noon. This orange one is still above 70 degrees. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm at a picnic and there's potato salad out that somebody left out from noon to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, up at room temperature, I'm not going to be eating it. And this is probably even worse because we don't know how much contamination there was. And some of these bacteria can double every 20 seconds. So that time frame, a lot of bacteria can be growing. And then if you look here even further, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, out at 6 hours, we're still at the mid-60s on that orange one. And then the blue one got fed. And that's what happened here. So when it got fed, it was 1, 2, 3.5 hours, and then it got warmed up and fed. So that one was maybe even contaminated already then. But these refrigerators are just not designed to remove that much heat that fast. I just think that this is, in my opinion, is not an acceptable way to cool colostrum. This would not work for milk you're selling to the creamery. If it got cold this slow, the creamery would be making all sorts of fuss about it. And another thing I want to point out about this is right above these bottles, this dairy stored their vaccines. So twice a day, when they put these bottles in here to get upon new harvest, these vaccines would be getting warm and in cooler throughout the day, but they'd be getting warmed up twice a day. That's probably not the way we want to do it. Yep. So I go to the next slide and I'll show some ways that people can get colostrum colder faster. So this one to the left is a dairy in Michigan that put in this itty bitty plate cooler right there next to the bulk tank, and with a pump on it. So they would harvest the colostrum in the breeze in the parlor, bring it into the bulk tank room here, and right away, and then run it through that plate cooler. So in a matter of just a couple minutes, it would go from cow temperature down to 36 degrees, and worked very well. The next one over, those are 2 plastic bottles that are filled with ice, and then put in the bottom of those of the colostrum harvesting bucket. And then so as soon as the colostrum hits it, it starts to get somewhat colder. And the one to the right just shows these bags here laying flat. These perfect udder bags. They could also be Ziploc bags, but something in there that lays flat in a freezer also gets cold pretty fast. We'll go back here and talk about these bottles a bit. I do like that idea, but one thing, they're not the easiest thing to clean, and I think it's really important to get them clean. You know, they get the milk on them, the fat and the protein from the colostrum, and they should be scrubbed well before they're refrozen and used again. These two to the right, these are from the same dairy. And this dairyman put in one of these Dairy Tech pasteurizers, which work really well. There's several commercial ones that work quite well. But instead of using tap water around this jacket, he's used chilled water. So as soon as a cow calves, he melts the colostrum, puts it in there, presses a button, and it goes from cow temperature down to 36 degrees in just a matter of a couple of minutes. Then when he gets enough, he presses a button and it goes up to 140 for 60 minutes. And then instead of being chilled with just regular tap water, it's chilled with that chilled water. So it goes down to 36 degrees quickly. And then he puts it in these perfect udder bags. And then he puts them in this is actually a freezer, not a refrigerator, but it's set at refrigerator temperature. It's set at 36 degrees. But part of the purpose of that is to have a refrigerator with lots of oomph so it can get things cold quickly. So that works very well. This colostrum is treated pretty much exactly like the milk that he sells to the creamery. All right, next slide. So now we're going to talk about pasteurization of colostrum, and I probably should use the word heat treatment. This particular one here is this was a homemade system, and at first I was a little disappointed that this dairy had put this homemade one in instead of buying a nice commercial one. But then I found out that they had put this in 20 years ago before anybody else was before you could really buy them commercially very well. So what they did is they watched a gauge. As soon as it got to 135, they shut the water off, thinking that it's going to get up to 140 and it'll be there long enough to do some good. So we actually put some thermometers in, and depending on what day it was and how much colostrum there was in there, and exactly when the worker saw that 135 and shut it off, it made a big difference. So if you see here, this green one on top, it gets up to above 145 for about 10 minutes. And so that's not good for the colostrum. That would have destroyed the antibodies. And then we get this one here that's only gets up to 135 only for about 5 or 6 minutes. It probably killed some of the bacteria, but probably not near enough, not as much as we want to get done. Okay, next slide. So this is a commercial one, and notice how it heats up. It gets up to 140, holds it there for an hour, and then it cools it down, in this case to tap water temperature. Then they'd put it in those perfect udder bags and then put them into the freezer. So that works pretty well. I think almost every one of these commercial ones that I've tested have worked as advertised. All right, so now I'm going to add a cue, and I want some ideas for cues on this. If anybody has some, they can put it in the chat. I think it's important to feed calves at about cow temperature. I know you're going to ask, somebody's going to ask what exactly that means. You know, cow temperature is about 101, 101 and a half, somewhere around there. I think if we're between 95 and 105, we're probably okay. But if we're down into the 80s or up into the 1-teens, we're definitely too hot. And you can't trust your arm to do that, because your arm gets calibrated with however cold it is outside. If you're outside working and it's minus 30 outside and you put your hand into a bucket of cool water, it feels warm, but it's not warm. And so it's important to really know what the temperature is and feed it. So if anybody can come up with a cue for that, let me know. So this was a dairy. This was the morning feeding, and they had 2 buckets. Bucket 1, which had A and B samples in it, and in bucket 2, which had A, B, and C in it. I was pretty happy with bucket 2. They were those were about the right temperatures. But bucket 1's 2 are too low. That's can cause the calf to get cold. Can cause some abomasum emptying. That's not ideal. Maybe lead to some Clostridium, which we do see sometimes on when we feed calves the wrong temperature, the older calves. Anyway, so in this case, there's a big difference between these 2 buckets on the same farm. And this is just a graph of the thermometer there. Okay, later in the morning, the that colostrum was fed at the right temperature, but it had been set out from noon to 6 o'clock because the calf did not drink it at 6 a.m. And then about at noon they fed the calf, and it set at room temperature all that time, and they reheated it. And so that's not healthy for the calf to get that load of bacteria that might have grown in that amount of time. Well, anyway, when I investigating colostrum issues or giving guidance to people on this, I'll always ask, do you measure the temperature of the colostrum when you feed the calves? And the answer is usually yes. But then when I ask, where is the thermometer? About half the time they can find it. And about half the time they can find it, the battery's out of it or it's broken. This particular one here is the one they were using, but it just isn't designed for this purpose. And notice that this is 100 degrees, 150 and 200 degrees. So if we're trying to tell the difference between 90 and 110, it's really hard to do it on this scale. So you really need a thermometer that gives us the temperature accurately right around 100 degrees. And I want to make a point here. There's another point there on that herd that we were doing this on. I went back 6.5 days later to get to collect the hobos and to read what they had said. And one of them was still in a bottle that had not been fed to a calf. And I think we need to have some way on a dairy to have reasonable colostrum rotation so that we're not feeding colostrum that's really, really old to calves. All right, next slide. All right, now we're going to talk about quantifying a little bit. So normally what we mean here is taking a blood sample from the calf and doing a lab test on it to see if it had enough antibodies. So here in the second column, we see serum IgG, and then that is considered the gold standard. That is really what we're after. We're after the amount of antibodies that are in the blood. But that's a difficult test to do cow side, and it's kind of expensive, and you got to send it off to a lab or buy a fairly expensive kit and have the expertise in how to run it. So most people consider that impractical. So they do one of the next two. So this is total protein is what TP stands for. That's measured in grams per deciliter. Or we can use the Brix scale. And this table here gives us readings in all of those categories so that we can pick which one we want to use on the farm. I'm used to using total protein is the one I'm used to using. Jen uses Brix. It's the same thing. Both use a refractometer, kind of a very similar method. But when we started discussing numbers and which ones, how well a dairy was doing, we were totally confused by what we were saying until we figured out that she was talking Brix and I was talking total protein. But when I was in vet school, we learned that 5 and above, 5 to 5.5 was borderline, less than 5 was bad, and above 5.5 was good. So if you look at now, we see this, we've changed our standards a lot. Now we know that we can get greater than 6 fairly regularly, and that's what we're calling good and excellent here on the total protein scores, which should be greater than 9 or so on the Brix reading. And I do want to make a point here about colostrum replacers. We didn't talk about them much today, but if you do use a colostrum replacer, the total protein and the Brix do not go up, even though the serum IgG does. So really the total protein and the Brix are only very legitimate tests for real colostrum, not for colostrum replacers. All right, Jen, go to the next one. So just a word of caution here on using a refractometer. You should calibrate it fairly regularly and follow the directions that come with the unit about how to do it, which usually has you use distilled water to zero the unit. That's the same whether it's a when you read analog with the blue line or whether it's a digital one. But I've seen people do this several times now with an analog one, that instead of zeroing it out at 1.0000 specific gravity, which is equal to 1.333 refractive index, which is the scale there in the middle, that's where distilled water should be. If you zero it over there to the left where the serum protein is, you're going to artificially raise the readings that you get, and you're going to think you're doing better than you really are. So it's important to have a calibrated instrument and to calibrate it properly. All right, Jen, next. I think this is your slide, right?
It is my slide, but maybe it should be yours, Phil, because you're the Wordle guru. But Dr. Jardon put this Wordle together just to kind of summarize what we've been talking about here today, talking about colostrum management. And so if you play Wordle, you know what this means, but be clean or squeaky clean. We want to feed our colostrum quickly. We want to feed ample quantity. We want to watch or monitor and quantify. And then we want to grade or test for the quality. And all of those 5 Qs are going to get us to get that young calf off on the right hoof. So as we kind of conclude our presentation here today, that's kind of our takeaways is, going back and reviewing your 5 Qs. Some of them you may have known for quite a while, and some of them you might want to review more often, particularly when we look at squeaky clean. I think there's a lot of good ways that we can start to cool our colostrum more quickly than maybe we have in the past. And then going back and, evaluating your program and making sure that we have all the steps taken and our protocols are still in place and we're not seeing procedural drift on our management. So with that, Phil, I think we're going to take some questions. And I'll probably stop sharing my screen here, Gail. So if there's any in the chat box, we can start to address those.
Yeah, if you have questions for Jen or Philip, go ahead and put those in the chat. Does somebody have an evaluation link to put in as well? So, all right, Jen's nodding. She's going to go ahead. If you want to let us know what you thought about today's program while we are doing our Q&A, go ahead and do that. Courtney says great presentation, so thank you, Courtney. That's high praise coming from up there in Madison, so thank you for that. I don't see any questions popping in right now, but I guess I'll start out. A common question that we get often when we're about colostrum and colostrum management is, what do you do when you don't have enough? Sometimes reality just hits and your inventory of colostrum is low. What strategies do we have when we just don't have a whole lot of colostrum on hand?
So I'll start with that one, and then Jen can add to it if she wants to. It's not uncommon that we tend to have a problem getting enough colostrum late in the summer. August, September, into the early fall. For just some reason, cows just don't like to give very much colostrum at that time. And some dairies seem worse than others, and people have tried to figure out what the cause is, whether it's heat stress or day length, maybe a combination of all those things. We don't really know, but it seems like it's hard to fix with management or feeding. It seems like it's just something we're kind of stuck with. So knowing that's going to happen, I think, is part of the battle, and just becoming prepared for it. So a few months before that, in the spring, start freezing colostrum. And colostrum can be frozen and it can keep for a long time that way. I would treat it the same way though. Keep it clean. Maybe pasteurize it first or heat treat it first, and then freeze it in quantities that you can thaw easily to feed to the calves. And of course, it's also a place to use colostrum replacers too. There's other reasons to use those sometimes too. If you're in a Yoni's control program or something like that, they can be kind of expensive, but they can be useful in those settings too. Jen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add, yes, when we don't have colostrum availability, if we can freeze it or use powder, but also taking a look at your management program too, right? So the employees that you have on your farm, how they're being trained, and sometimes using fresh colostrum or frozen colostrum just isn't feasible, uh, you know, depending on the time of day when you're trying to feed colostrum, right? So if I have to wait a couple hours to thaw the colostrum, then that's going to delay the time that that calf is going to get that colostrum. So maybe consider the powder during those times, because we really want to make sure that we're adequately feeding that calf on a timely basis. And if that means using powder over fresh colostrum, that might be more feasible for that.
I have a question
Pam?
for Jim.
Oh, go ahead.
People talk about transition feeding, and we didn't talk about that very much. What are some ways people can do that, or what are reasons people would do it?
Yeah, I think, we mentioned a little bit about, feeding more colostrum is better because of the immunoglobulins, but there's research now showing transition milk also has benefits to the calf. So yes, more colostrum is going to help reduce our treatments and mortality rates, but feeding transition milk is also helping reduce some of those health incidences in those calves. And we're seeing some longer term benefits to transition milk too. So if we can collect that milk longer and be able to use your methods for cooling it properly and heat treating it, or pasteurizing that milk as we get into more of that transition milk, and finding ways that we can store it to feed it, we can extend the use of that colostrum.
Yeah, I find it interesting that we look at a beef calf, it drinks colostrum that first day. And then the second day, it drinks second day milk. And the third day, it drinks third day milk. And with our dairy calves, we tend to feed them really good colostrum, or at least that's the plan, to feed them really good colostrum that first day. And then we switch them pretty much totally over to whole milk or a milk replacer or something. And I think it makes sense to treat them more like a beef calf and spread that out some. And I've seen some pretty interesting ways people have done that when they'll keep, the second and third day colostrum separate, feed that to the younger calves, not the first day, but second and third day. Other people will take some of the colostrum that doesn't pass and then mix that with the milk for those calves that first week or two. There's some interesting ways dairymen have come up to get that to work.
Amber's asking us, does anybody know an approximate equivalent of protein color block swabs to an ATP meter reading? So is there any sort of approximation when you use the color swabs to the actual measurement from a luminometer?
Well, I'll take it first, Jen, then you can correct me if I'm wrong. They're really testing for two different things. The protein swabs are testing for a residue. So let's say we cleaned the surface and got it really hot, but the protein's still on there. We won't find live bacteria, so our ATP meter won't show a high reading, but our protein one will. And then if we let it sit all day, that film can start to grow bacteria. So it's really testing two different things. One's a protein film. That means the surface isn't clean and there's a potential for bacteria to get on there. And the other one, the ATP meter, ATP meter is for the luminometer. It's actually checking for live bacteria. So I think there's not probably a direct correlation between the two all the time.
All right. Anything to add, Jen?
He answered it very well. I don't have anything to add.
Got a couple of questions here. Does a Brix refractometer have a temperature zone that is best? I know we have to standardize on the tubes, but how about on the Brix? Is that got a zone?
That's a good question, and it's an essay question. How much time do you? So,
I think this goes until 1:30. So.
All right. So the manufacturer of those say that they are temperature adjusted, and that's somewhat true. And you could put a sample on there and it's not exactly right and leave it on there for 30 seconds or so, it'll become adjusted. But we think about where the thermometer that's measuring that temperature is, it's in the crystal. So if we have the refractometer in our truck and it's 30 degrees below zero, and we bring it in to the calf barn and we put on a sample that's 100 degrees, it's going to not read properly. So the companies and all the companies that make these say the same thing. It's best to have the temperature of the liquid, the temperature of the unit, and the temperature of the environment all about the same. So it's a good idea to get those all equilibrated to be about the same. I've seen it in my hands where I didn't wait long enough and I got really screwy readings because it was way off. Even though officially it's temperature adjusted, we can only expect it to temperature adjust within a reasonable amount of time and temperature range. Did that answer your question, Fred?
Very, very well. Yep. I have another question. We talked about using detergents and sanitizers to clean calf feeding equipment. Are there any specific chemistries we should be using to ensure that that equipment is clean?
Jen, do you want to take that one? Or you want me to take it as the veterinarian?
Why don't you start?
So, actually our cleaning, we should clean up very similar to how we clean the line for the equipment that we're going to milk cows with. So very similar things, very similar goals to that. So that's the detergent, the milk stone remover, make sure we get that kind of thing to help with the acid to get the stone off of there if we need to. And then there's lots of different disinfectants that'll work really well. Chlorine dioxide will work quite well. And it's frequently used to disinfect lots of things on a dairy. And I won't tell you right here exactly because I can't remember the concentrations on those, but they're available and I'd follow what the manufacturer says. Oh, Jen's putting it in though. She has the source right there.
Yeah, I get this question a lot, Phil. So I have this link on my computer because depending on the types of organisms that you're trying to disinfect, there's different detergents or disinfectants that work better or worse for things. So I always refer them to this link, and you can kind of sort through which ones work better for what you're working with.
Very good. Very good.
Final question's kind of a quirky question, but we've been asked, can I add hydrogen peroxide to some high bacteria colostrum and make it better?
I've not gotten that question before. My guess is it's going to be hydrogen peroxide is H2O2, and it's poisonous to bacteria, and that's why we use it as a disinfectant. But there's so much organic material in milk that it's going to deactivate it pretty fast. I can't believe it's going to be very effective. It's going to be more effective in a cleaner type liquid like water or a fairly clean surface.
Then will it affect the immunoglobulins?
I don't know the answer to that, but my guess is it probably doesn't affect them very much.
Yeah.
But you want to be careful though not to have too much in there when you feed it to a calf and have it, because it makes a lot of bubbles. And,
Yep.
and the calf might have to burp more than it can.
I don't know if you
Okay.
heard the joke about two guys walked into a bar and the first one said, "I'd like some H2O," and the second man said, "I'd like some H2O2," and the second man died.
Okay.
Is that the note we want to end on, or?
Yeah, I think I'm done with my questions.
Well, there's something we didn't talk about much today, and that's maybe a little bit in the rotation of colostrum. So, I mentioned that, we don't want it to get real old. And when people ask, how long is colostrum good for? I remember seeing an article once, when I was a little kid, that colostrum was good for a week in the refrigerator. And I don't like just carte blanche answers like that, because it depends on well it was treated, what the bacteria load was before it went in the refrigerator, how fast it got cold, how cold the refrigerator was, and all that. But I see a lot of people do is they'll have a real rigorous system for rotating their colostrum. And the colostrum they're feeding is always 4 or 5 days old because they have plenty. And I would rather see it be the fresh colostrum or 1 or 2 days, freeze some of that other stuff to catch up, and then don't always be feeding 4 or 5 day old colostrum. Instead, feeding, 1 or 2 day old colostrum instead.
That ties in very well with Dr. Howard Tyler did some projects a couple of years ago looking at that, taking some samples from Midwest herds and looking at the quality of the milk and the bacteria contamination, and kind of what you're saying, within 1 to 2 days, if you're not using it, it needs to go in the freezer because it starts to get elevated contamination or bacteria counts in the milk. So that definitely ties in very well.
Now I'll throw in one off the top of my head question. When I came up here 8 years ago, one of the first herds I visited was fermenting his colostrum. What's your thoughts there?
So first of all, for use as a antibody source, I'm against it. Because in the fermentation process, the things are being destroyed, and one of those could very well be the antibodies. It also changes the pH. So then the question is whether it could be good feed. And I think it can be, but it's not always. It depends on how well the process was managed. So I'm not a big fan of it. I think there's too many things that can go wrong. So what's your opinion, Fred? Do you have an opinion on it, or did it work for him?
I took 2 months to convince him to not do that anymore. But, he had success with it. He had some of the slickest little brown calves around. And in that instance, okay, he was managing it well, but it wasn't what I think could be consistently done in most dairy herds. So we did get him to freeze colostrum, feed it fresh, and freeze enough so he had extra. But
when you think about, some of the, pasteurization kills bacteria, but there's also some cheese fermentation processes that kill bacteria too. Some cheeses that are raw milk cheeses can be safe if they get to low enough pH and all that. But that has to be really carefully managed, and that's harder to do than it seems.